This week, we are going to be covering automotive TIG welding and getting a bunch of work done on this car. We're going to get the front flares welded on seamlessly, planished out. We're going to go over how to set up your welder to do that, the do's and don'ts with TIG welding on an automotive vehicle, because automotive vehicle is kind of a double down of the same thing, but that's fine. We're going to keep rolling with that. Hey, what you doing? What are you shooting? Getting games on your phone? So tell your wife you'll take the trash out later because it's time to watch Crucible Coachworks. All right, so I need to tear down the front end here so that we can get this piece welded on, which means I need access. So I'm gonna take these lights out here so I don't ruin them with any sparks, because why would I ever want to do that? That would just be kind of rude. I'm gonna pull the wheel off for access here. The goal is to get this piece welded nice and seamlessly, which is gonna need some fettling, because you can see like we have a gap here and whatnot. Use this bumper here as a guide for as I go. I'm also gonna hit puberty mid-sentence as well. I'm gonna mention at some point about gloves, because that's why I always wear gloves, because it gets rusty. But
well, there you go. You just did.
Oh, you're filming right now. Yep. Step one of the video that's most important of everything I can teach you in this entire video is wear gloves. Your oils in your hands on bare metal will rust, especially in weather like today where it's humid. We're in Pennsylvania and it's been very humid lately. Even like right here where I lean my arm on here, the next day, look at that. It's like poop. First, wait. Safety first. We made this piece in a previous video, and I need to get it welded on here. There's a couple challenges with that though, because this piece is roughed in. The plane isn't exactly the way it needs to be to flow into this panel correctly, but that's okay. It was like that because I actually need to cut this panel back first before I do anything. So what I did was I took a marker, traced the outline of where this part's gonna be. I'm gonna cut these panels back to within maybe like 5 millimeters of that line, so I can have less resistance to fit this thing up to where it needs to go. And I'm gonna hammer and dolly and get this thing to kind of sit nicely, because that's very important. Your pre-weld fitment is one of the most important things that you can do to make sure when you're TIG welding on a car, or even MIG welding, that you're gonna have a high quality end product. Good enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Not a problem, all right? The gap on top of here sucks, which I already knew. I had this laser level across the bottom. You can see the nice little laser painting around the edge. And I cut this loose to kind of splay it out a little bit to kind of flow in correctly. Incorrectly is like incorrectly, not incorrectly. So this front I'm happy with, but this radius is off. So I think what I actually need to do is about right about here. You have to shrink this edge to kind of just wrap it down a little bit to kind of have this flow. That should get us where we're going. So we're gonna hop over to the kick shrinker here and tune this bad boy in. Curve to it now. Just a wee bit. Okay. Alright, we're a lot closer, but now I gotta stretch right here. I get to lay over. Can you understand what I'm saying with this in? Mm-hmm. Good. Because I don't want to take it out. I feel like a... You ever play Sarge's Heroes before?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like that. Safety first. Hey, what you doing? What are you shooting? Getting games on your phone? So now that I got this gap tuned in, the next step is to figure out what I need to cut exactly to get this thing to fit perfectly. Because you want to have the tightest gap possible when you're TIG welding. Unlike MIG, where you want to have like a slight gap to make sure your penetration is good. The TIG, if you can get it so close that you can't even see light through it and you can weld right through it without using filler rod, that's your best case scenario. However, there is also a line between what is too much time spent fitting up and what's not enough. You know, you gotta find that balance and what works best for you and your workflow. Personally, I try to get it close without spending way too much time on it. I'm gonna use my favorite So we're gonna use my favorite system for scribing and cutting, which is die-chem steel blue. It's just machinist bluing is what people call it. You can get it in aerosol form or in a can that you dip a brush in. I like the aerosol form because I don't want to have to like struggle to find a brush every time I go to do this. But again, whatever works best for you. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull this panel off, spray some die-chem on, and then we're gonna scribe it. So now that I have my bluing down, I like to use a scribe to mark where I'm going to be cutting for my weld because it is much thinner than if I were to say use a marker. And all I gotta do then is just cut up to the edge of the scribe line and we're good to go. This is why having good fitment beforehand is important, because if I had that big gap there and I tried to hammer it over to make it work, that's gonna change that entire line, and then you're gonna have a giant gap or not a gap at all and have to cut it back some more. It's just it's a whole thing that you don't wanna deal with. Bam! Now you can see plain as day where I'm cutting to. I'm gonna cut it up just up to the edge of the scribe line. So this side's gonna cut off, and in theory, it should all fit. In theory, of course. I'm full of theories. So now that I got my panel all fitted up, it fit up okay. I messed up with my scribe line a little bit. I cut a little high on it. That's my own fault. However, the gap is still plenty good, so we're good to go. I just have a little higher bar for myself usually. So now we're gonna dig into getting the welder set up when you're TIG welding on a vehicle. There are a couple important things to keep in mind. Number one, you wanna make sure any electronics that you have in the vehicle are protected or at least have the battery disconnected. Number two, when you put your ground clamp on the vehicle, make sure there are no electronics between you where you're striking your arc and the ground clamp. That'll help mitigate any possible issues later on. A lot of people say you should never TIG weld on an automotive vehicle because it can cause problems with the computers. However, your mileage may vary. We'll leave it that way.
Crucible Coachworks is not responsible for any damage done to a vehicle. Our content is strictly for entertainment purposes and not to be copied by anyone in their workplace, home, or hobbit hole. Consult your doctor if you experience nausea, headache, seizures, itchy toes, or death. Crucible Coachworks is not liable for any damages caused by viewers who turn into a werewolf and decimate an entire village, including the elder, who is finally having their character redemption arc and being a generally good chap. Those involved with writing this disclaimer have been sacked. Those involved with editing this disclaimer have been sacked.
What I've found that works great for me, because we do mostly 19 gauge steel here, is I set up the amperage to about 37 amps on the peak. And then I actually have switched over to using pulse, whereas I typically would not use pulse, but I kind of switched over lately. I've been mixing it up a little bit. So I like to use pulse. It pulses down to about 30% of the amperage. So 30% of 37 is, I don't know, you get a calculator out. And then I also put the pulse frequency extremely high. I have it 191 hertz right now, which is basically like a buzz. That's why when I weld on steel, people always comment on TikTok or Instagram and go, why are you having an AC mode? It sounds like you're welding aluminum. I'm not actually welding aluminum. I just have a very high frequency. I found that actually helps with my end result. Again, mileage may vary based on use. And then, yeah, that's the basic settings I like to do. I also like to use a smaller cup because this is not stainless steel. I don't need a ton of argon coverage, just enough to keep the weld itself clean. So I use a 6 or a 5 usually. This is a 6. And then after that, it's all welding technique, which I always start out with making tacks every roughly ½ inch, and then hammering and dolling those tacks to stretch them back out to relax the panel for my final blast through. Alright, so I got it all tacked up. I have my tacks roughly every ½ inch, give or take. I don't think in standard, I think in metric. So let's say they're more like every 8 millimeters. Now, what I'm going to do, and I already started doing it a little bit, is I'm going to go through with a hammer and dolly, and I'm going to smash the tacks individually to kind of make the panel relax. So what happens is, with every weld tack you do, the metal expands with heat, and as it cools, it contracts and actually shrinks more than it originally was. So the goal was to get the multiple panels here to all sit nice and smooth and have a nice smooth transition before doing our final weld. If the panels are not smoothly fitted, they're going to buckle around all crazy like when we go to weld it. Alright, so I'm gonna weld this in a way that will drive many body men insane. And you can reserve your questions for later because we're going to talk about this later on in the video. So if you caught that in the time lapse we just did, I welded this entire piece mostly without stopping. You know, I just stopped because I had to shimmy my arms around or whatever. I do that for one major reason, and that it's Monday afternoon, my dudes.
Monday.
It's Monday. Monday. All right. I do that for one major reason. That's because I want to use the heat to my advantage and just kind of walk it out the panel. A lot of people will say that you need to use a MIG welder and you need to tack and jump around and tack and tack and tack and tack and tack. And what happens is you actually give it more of an oil can warpage effect than you would if you just blast through it. And not only that, if you use a MIG, it's much harder to work afterwards. But with the TIG, it affords you a much cleaner weld. You're able to actually weld the entire thing and have a nice malleable weld that's very strong. And yeah, I have a little bit of undercut here and there, but you can make it almost completely disappear, or if you weld it perfectly, it will actually disappear if you spend much time with it. So what I'm gonna do, I have this flare. In a previous video, I welded this on. And by welded on, I actually mean I just tacked it, tack and tack and tack and tack and tack, just like I did up front, and then left it there because I wanted to be certain that this was 100% where it was going to be in case of things needing to be adjusted or whatnot. What I'm gonna do now, it's already pre-prepped. I have the tacks all done. I had them hammered back out. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna blast from one end to the other end, hopefully without stopping. The only stoppage that's going to happen is if I make a mistake and I fumble something or I run out of filler rod or something like that. Doing that allows me to take my heat from one end to the other end, kind of just walk it out the panel, and yes, it will warp, and yes, it will shrink. When you heat up metal, it expands and it contracts much tighter than it was originally, which I've already mentioned before, but we're gonna hammer that into your heads because this is very important. A lot of people say, oh, well, you welded a panel on, now you gotta shrink it to make it fit. Nah, it's literally the opposite. So we're gonna weld it one bead from end to end, and then we're gonna planish it. And I'm gonna explain planishing after I weld it. This video has been paid for and sponsored by Eastwood. This is the Eastwood TIG 200 LCD. It's the upgrade to the previous TIG 200. This one I like a lot. In fact, it's become the most used welder in our shop, and we have some pretty expensive welders here. Because of its LCD screen and having a computer in it, this welder has pulse and you can save presets, which is a huge benefit over the previous model. This beast is a workhorse. I can use it all day, no problem. We even have the add-on TIG water cooler, which gives it even longer duty cycle. So if you're looking for an affordable option, the Eastwood TIG 200 LCD is probably the best bang for your buck. Link down in the description below. So we're all welded now. It's cooling still, it's a little warm. I welded from this end down that way. Now, some of you are watching and wondering, why did he weld downhill? There's two reasons. One, I wanted to keep my heat going the same direction across the panel. And number two, I could have also gone the other direction as well. That's not really a reason, it's more of a answer. I could have welded, up to about here where I was comfortable, flipped around, and welded back up this way, and then did the same thing I mentioned earlier, which is backstepping, by just kind of overlapping the weld a little bit to get the heat to be consistent. And in hindsight, I probably should have done that to make it just kind of flow a little bit better. I had a little bit of struggle welding this area down here, and there's two reasons for that. And there's actually two reasons for real this time. The first reason I had trouble was because of the angle. I was kind of welding in an awkward way to the point I had to lay on the ground to weld it, which, I mean, the best welding position is the one that you're most comfortable in, and I was pretty comfortable there until my neck got kind of sore. However, the other reason that I had trouble is because about here back, there is a brace that bolts the fender on. So from like here back, there's a lot of material that's kind of layered there and whatnot, and it made it a little tough with the heat dispersion and whatnot. And because I was going downhill, I was getting it hot coming down, and then the heat was going back up into the weld again, which kind of like doubled down on the heat. So in hindsight, I probably should have actually gone back the other direction, which I'll just do on the other side. But it's not a huge deal because every weld that's TIG welded can be planished afterwards, which is now the part I was talking about earlier we're going to dig into, which is planishing your welds. Planishing time! Planishing your weld is when you hammer and dolly or use any other tooling to smash that weld to stretch it back out. As I mentioned many times in this video, and I keep hammering into you guys, when you weld something, it heats up, it expands, then it contracts tighter, which is called shrinking because the surface area is now smaller. So what we need to do now is stretch the weld bead itself back out to match the rest of the panel, because before I welded this was nice and smooth. That means that we can hammer and dolly it back to smooth with not too much persuasion. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a hammer and dolly, much like these two right here. I'm gonna use the dolly on the back side that matches the radius or is a little sharper so I don't accidentally flatten something out. I'm gonna hammer directly in the weld and smash it into itself. Smashing it into the weld into itself is gonna cause it to stretch, which will bring it back to where it should hopefully be. Now, typically, what I need to do is go through, I'm gonna rough it in, then I'm gonna go back through and just grind just the tops of the welds because the very, very peaks don't really need to be there and they can be a little bit of a nuisance depending on how I welded it. Some spots, if I had issues, let's say it was starting to drop through and I added more filler rod or whatever, it's a little thick. So I wanna make sure that's consistently smooth and consistent thickness before I go too far with the planishing process. Another really important thing is hammer care. When you're planishing welds and doing any kind of body work, you want to make sure that your hammer has the appropriate face on it. Roll the bit. For every action, there is an equal opposite reaction. Fig Newton, Ryan Krause. Today, we're talking about hammers. Every little imperfection that's on your body hammer will translate onto the material that you're hammering upon. So like that, maybe? You see that? All those imperfections are from that hammer, the equal opposite reaction. So what I like to do is to grind the face of the hammer to a very low crown. And I'll use a belt grinder to get that profile. And I'll just kind of rough it in and get it started. After that, I'll jump to a vise, clamp down the hammer, and then I'll use different grits of sandpaper to bring it up close to a polish. This is important because every single little scratch will translate to your material, so you want to stand it out as far as you can until you can polish it. And then after that, I'll use the polishing wheel and I will polish it out to a smooth, buttery mirror finish. And it only takes about 30 minutes per hammer. So now that your hammer is nice and polished, you're ready to tackle a weld like this. Let's get planishing. Planishing time! I had to get Roger out to move some material around to get it to be nice and level, so Roger came in handy yet again. So we have this side pretty well finished out. I'd say it's like 90–95% there. We're gonna stop with this, and we're gonna jump to the other side now and do it all over again, except this time I'm gonna start in the bottom of the fender and weld uphill and bring it around, which I think will give me a little bit of a struggle, because I had a little bit of a fight here getting this leveled out, because there's not really much rear access there at all. I had to use like a actual, I literally had to use a pry bar to slide in between two pieces of metal and kind of use it as a dolly, and it was a bit of a fight. So I'm hoping if I go uphill instead on that side, it'll go a little bit smoother. And then after that, we're going to discuss a little bit more of post-weld finishing. My ear protection. This is my ear protection. Relax, all right? Calm down, Dylan. So I want to touch a little bit more on the shrinkage of the weld and why we planish it afterwards. So this weld bead right here, right? We can imagine it like it's a string and it's pulling on the panel. This is not a string, this is a wire I found on the ground from some project that doesn't matter anymore. However, if I were to take a string, right, through the whole weld and pull it tighter, it would, you can kind of imagine what it would do on a surface. So like say that this weld is the string and it's pulling tighter, it's gonna pull in closer and kind of pull in like this, and also want to pull deeper into the panel, which is where the warpage comes from that everyone refers to when you weld a panel. So what I'm doing effectively is I'm hammering on the string, which is stretching it back out and allowing it to relax back to where it should originally be. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's another visualization I thought of this morning when I climbed out of bed. I don't know. Right now, you can see that this weld, from back there, it probably looks like it's pretty straight. However, it is warped. It needs some love, especially back here where I got a little bit more heat in the panel. Again, because the whole vertical thing just made it tough. We're gonna go through now with a hammer and dolly, and I'm gonna hammer directly on the weld. I'm gonna smash the crap out of that weld to allow it to then expand back to where it should be. So we've got it all welded up. The front end is almost completely welded. We still have the front bumper flares to weld. We have a bunch of shaving to do, which is to remove things from the vehicle. So we're gonna be going over that in an upcoming video soon. So check back, guys, next week as we continue on the Porsche 911 Widebody Backdate Project. Later.